conférence débat qui nous donne le plaisir d'accueillir d'éminentes personnalités sur une thématique qui nous intéresse tous très vivement, but it's good for your French, qui nous intéresse tous éminemment, puisque la digitalisation est un des avenirs de notre monde, sinon l'avenir qui nous impactera le plus durablement. Et sur une telle thématique, la Genève internationale est non seulement bien placée, mais doit se placer encore mieux pour en traiter tous les aspects relatifs à la gouvernance et tous les aspects relatifs à l'impact social que ce processus rapide en accélération peut comporter. Et c'est pour cette raison que nous sommes très heureux d'accueillir cette table ronde précédée d'une introduction par M. Brad Smith, président de Microsoft et par ailleurs ancien étudiant de l'Institut, puisqu'il a étudié le droit international avec sa femme Cathy au milieu des années 1980, en venant de la Columbia Law School, où il est retourné ensuite pour terminer son diplôme avant de faire la carrière très prestigieuse que vous connaissez de General Counsel de Microsoft, puis depuis 2015 de président. Brad Smith, avec son idée de Geneva Digital Convention, contribue à sa manière à renforcer la place de la Genève internationale dans le domaine de la digitalisation, et c'est donc avec le plus grand intérêt que nous l'écouterons. Merci, Brad.
Thank you. I first wanted to say what an honor it is to be here with such an extraordinary group of people who are doing such important work for the world. When I was a student here, the rule was you needed to understand French, but you could speak English. I'm going to continue in that habit. I started as a student. And I'll just speak for about 10 minutes, and then I think we'll have a very interesting discussion with a wonderful panel and a real conversation, which is, I think, the real goal of the evening. The question, as you can see behind me, is can Geneva make digital collaboration a win-win? I hope so. I think the world needs Geneva to address the issues that digital technology are creating around the world and find a path forward that will serve the world well. I always like to start by reminding all of us of where we've come from. And I think especially when you have the opportunity to speak in Geneva, that is especially important. It is remarkable to me to see how technology has evolved, not just over years or decades, but over centuries, and to see what that has meant for the challenges and what it has meant for Geneva. It really was in the 1800s that technology started fundamentally to change the face of the battlefield. Bullets were hollowed out, artillery became longer range and more powerful, and ultimately it was in the late 1850s on a battlefield in northern Italy that the world took stock of the horrifying aspects of what technology had created. And thankfully, it was because of a group of individuals in Geneva that the governments of Europe came to Geneva. And in 1863, they entered into an agreement that created the International Committee for the Red Cross and rules that were designed to protect combatants from the horrors that technology had created. Of course, technology did not stand still. It continued to advance in all kinds of ways. People learned to fly. The combustion engine changed life around the world. But weapons became more horrifying still. People invented dynamite, and then they invented chemical weapons, and then we saw the horrors of World War I when technology was on display yet again. people again came to Geneva. And of course, the League of Nations was founded directly as a result. And despite, unfortunately, all the lessons that humanity had learned, we still failed to grapple successfully with the problems of the time. And I think in many ways, it's always worth reflecting on what happened in the 1930s. Technology had turned a biplane into a bomber. And as we saw a new plane of warfare, namely in the air, people hoped that governments could come to Geneva in a disarmament conference and ensure some order, even some sanity. And of course, as we all know, the world failed. But after World War II, people came to Geneva yet again. And in 1949, I think in one of the great diplomatic triumphs of the 20th century, the ICRC brought together governments and persuaded all of them to agree that they not only had a moral commitment, but would accept a legal obligation to protect civilians even in times of war. It gave birth to international humanitarian law as we know it today, a field that is sometimes breached but keeps people safe, that literally saves lives because it exists. So here we are yet again in a new century in Geneva yet again. And technology is continuing to race forward. And you won't be surprised to hear that for somebody like me who works at a company like Microsoft, every day we are excited about what we think technology can do. It is altogether likely that in our lifetime, if not just the decade ahead, artificial intelligence will help us cure many forms of cancer. Artificial intelligence will help us solve some of the most vexing problems of the planet, even the problems that ail the planet, as we're putting AI to use to address the world's oceans, biodiversity, climate change, and the like. And let's face it, we need all the help we can get. And yet at the same time, we are seeing a new plane of war. If the 20th century brought us war in the air, the 21st century has brought us war in cyberspace. It is, interestingly enough, a form of war that takes place during what is supposed to be a time of peace, as we increasingly live in a moment in history when more nation states are using digital technology to attack each other. And the irony in part is that in contrast to the principles of the Fourth Geneva Convention, governments are sometimes attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure, not as collateral damage, but by design. In 2017, on a single day in May, the North Korean government unleashed what was called the WannaCry attack and disabled 300,000 computers in more than 150 countries. The National Health Service in the United Kingdom had to close a third of its hospitals. Never in the history of warfare had any government managed to attack 150 nations in the course of 24 hours. And yet, just 6 weeks later, we saw the Russians unleash what became known as the NotPetya attack on the nation of Ukraine, disabling more than 10% of that country's computers, leaving mothers in a position where they could neither withdraw cash from an ATM nor use their credit cards to pay for food because the attack had disabled so many parts of the nation's network. And that, unfortunately, is in some ways the tip of the iceberg, because what we've learned since is that starting in 2016, we have seen determined efforts to use technology to disrupt democracies around the world, to attack candidates and political parties and think tanks that are some of the pillars of our democratic institutions, to threaten the future of voting by probing whether it is possible to disable voting machines. And unfortunately, the answer today remains yes, they can. To use technology to exploit the social media that we all rely on every day and to sow disinformation into political processes, especially at key moments in time. And so fundamentally, the question is, what are we going to do about it? I think the world needs Geneva and the diplomatic community that works here to play a leading role. It was this that led us in 2017 to call for what we called a digital Geneva Convention. In other words, principles that would protect civilians on the internet in the 21st century the way the Fourth Geneva Convention did for all of us in 1949. And as we've readily acknowledged since, of course, the first step should be to build on what we have already. This can't be an exercise in starting with a blank piece of paper, because a blank piece of paper would actually take us backwards rather than forwards. The world can build on the United Nations Charter, it can build on the Fourth Geneva Convention, and it can add to it from there. We do need some new ideas as well. We need to fill in the blanks in the rules that exist today where there are gaps. And today there are some gaps, including, for example, some of the issues relating to the protection of elections and voting and democracy and democratic processes. But more than that, we need to recognize that there is something different, that there is something distinctive about this fourth plane called cyberspace. Unlike land or sea or the air, it actually is often private property. It is created and it is operated typically by technology companies. And then it includes all of the things that we own ourselves. It includes the pockets in our phone, the phones in our pockets. It includes the laptops on our desks. And hence, if we're going to be effective in addressing these issues in the 21st century, we're going to need not just multilateral initiatives like we saw in the 20th, we're going to need multi-stakeholder initiatives as well. We really do need to bring together governments and civil society and business and tech companies to take the steps that are needed together to keep the world safe. We need to do all of that around the world, but I would argue that we most especially need to do that here in Geneva. It's why we've been so supportive as a company in taking new steps, in helping to build the foundation for new NGOs, new people and groups that will be part of this community, as you're going to see in the weeks ahead. Ultimately, keeping the world safe is just one of the steps we need to take. We need to ensure that technology is disseminated broadly, that everyone has access not just to the internet, but access to the internet at broadband speeds, that everyone has access to the skills that will be needed to fill the jobs that will be created, that we take new measures to protect people's privacy, both from government surveillance and from misuse of data by businesses and the tech sector itself. In short, the world needs a bold agenda to address these issues, and it needs a bold agenda that brings people together. I think that's what we're starting to see emerge around the world. It's what we saw last year in Paris, when we saw now 65 governments, more than 500 signatories come together to endorse the Paris call for trust in cybersecurity. It is what we've seen from the United Nations and the Secretary General's initiative. It is this kind of step that we have the opportunity to talk about this evening, and most importantly, to build on each and every day in the years ahead. In sum, our view is we need to act with a sense of urgency, because these issues don't get better with age. The problems just become harder. And yet at the same time, we need to act with a long-term vision and commitment, because for the students who will start at this institute this fall, these issues will be part of their lives for the rest of their lives. They will change, they will evolve, but they're not going to go away. For all of us, they're part of our future. So thank you. I look forward to the conversation this evening.